I thought you were recording already, but anyway.
No, I am now.
Righty. Okay, so thank you everyone, Ruth, Pietra, Liz, for tuning into this session. So this is just going to be for anyone else listening, because we're going to post this to the Mighty Network. This was basically a discussion we wanted to have about we want to open up a Q&A group on Mighty so that we can help answer questions from the community. But you know, one of the big things is giving people answers often negates their necessity to learn. And so we've been sort of having this conversation in the Foot Nerd community for a while about answering a question with another question. And so, you know, one thing we just mentioned before is that fielding questions from the community is a really important element of learning for us Foot Nerds, to be able to get an idea of where people lack understanding, where are the blind spots in understanding health from the community, but also what assumptions are people making that maybe we can ask better questions to challenge. So I'd love to hear everyone's take on, you know, just kind of give a little bit of your personal experience on answering health questions, because I think it's a really hard thing to do, and it's a very big learning experience, or at least it has been for me in a big way. So let's just go around, like, just for a minute or two, say why, you know, what experience do you have in answering health questions, and what have you learned throughout that experience so far? So Ruth, you want to kick us off?
Sure. My experience answering health questions are that when people come to you in a like you were saying, like, as you have answers and they have paid to get the answers, that is like a lot of responsibility. I think Lori's coming on right now.
Sorry about that alarm. Apparently
it's
there's
time.
a stay-at-home order in Ontario, and they like to send beeps to our phones. It's so weird.
Oh wow! I thought
Yeah.
I thought it was technical difficulties,
No.
or it's your wake up, your alarm to wake up.
Yeah, it's a pretty like imposing thing. If you're driving on the road and you're used to like silence, nothing goes off.
Yeah,
like that doesn't seem safe.
yeah, exactly.
Hey, Laurie.
And Justin's coming in too right now.
Oh, amazing. Got a
Awesome.
gang.
Yeah, I guess the alarm was good because it made sure that nobody missed anything.
There you go. Always a reason.
So what I was saying is that I felt a lot of responsibility when before I realized that maybe asking questions relieves the responsibility and makes you feel like you have more energy if you ask good questions. And I realized that the reason why asking questions is difficult in that relationship of the knower and the seeker is that eventually the questions get to a place where the other person feels vulnerable. And so I think sometimes it's easier to answer the question than it is to get to that place where you have to hold space for somebody who is probably feeling something pretty intense. So that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's always easier to give superficial answers. It's like an easy way out. But it's harder to put the thought energy into thinking like, what question does this person need to be asked for them to reflect on finding their own answer? And that's, I think this common thread with health is like, we tend to like to give answers based on our perspective and our experience, which is great. But instead of giving an answer based on that experience, maybe we should just share our experience to inspire them to find their own answer. And like, that's where, okay, Q&A is great to field questions and engage with the community, but we don't want to find ourselves giving too many answers. So yeah, thanks for that, Ruth. Pietra?
Yeah. Can I just, somebody else go before me, because I'm almost home. I'm in the car driving, so I'm trying to focus.
No worries. Liz, you can go. Laurie and Justin, thanks for tuning in. So one thing we're doing is just talking about our experience in handling questions related to health from either family or clients, patients, community, whatnot, and sort of what we've learned along that journey. Because I mean, the essence of today's call is to come to a shared understanding of how to answer questions without giving answers. And so we'll chat about that at the end, but we're just going around, just quickly sharing our experience and what we've learned in answering questions. And then we'll dive into, you know, like together come up with some sort of shared guidelines of how to effectively engage with a Q&A group in Mighty and maybe even help each other have a deeper understanding of how to answer health questions, because it's definitely an art and it's not an easy thing to do. But I think when done correctly, it can be extremely powerful for both you and for the person coming to seek help from you. So Liz, you want to go for it?
Yeah. So I'm not a health professional by any means. So I don't deal with this all the time, but I do weird things like walk around barefoot, and like that leads people to question my sanity sometimes. Yeah, I guess for me it's more of I'm trying to get my body to the point where I can say like, hey, I've solved this issue, because like I still haven't solved all of my body issues yet, but I do get a lot of questions, little things I can get into. Like I'll walk around with sandals and I think it's not cold, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, aren't your feet cold? And I'm like, no, they're actually really warm. And I'll be like, did you know that if there's more circulation in your feet, then your your feet are warmer? I don't know.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
a prime example though, like, because you discovered that through your experience, and they probably didn't know that. You're not telling them they should go out and do it barefoot, but like you can tell them from your experience, I've learned that functional feet are warm, and it's like that's maybe a new piece of information for them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's kind of hard when people seem already set in their opinions, like oh, I couldn't wear those, they don't have support, or like, oh, I need support. And it's hard to be like, well, like, why do you think you need support? Because like they haven't, like, they seem very like afraid, almost like if they don't have their inserts in, something will happen. And I do know somebody who has who's had like plantar issues, and she's had orthotics for like years and years and years, and she went for a walk without her inserts in her boots and tore her plantar fascia. And her like logic was like, oh, I should have worn the inserts. And I'm like, I don't know. But I feel like for me, I have to actually know that person. So like I know her pretty well, and like I always talk about foot stuff, and like just kind of like asking common sense questions like, okay, so if you had an issue with your wrist and the doctor said like you'd have to be in a cast for the rest of your life, like that doesn't make sense, right? And it's kind of the same with your feet. So just kind of like getting on the other person's level, I think, and appealing to something that they would already agree with. But yeah, I tend to sometimes get questions asked of me more. So then it's hard for me to get in a situation where I'm asking questions back. Like if I'm on the beam at the gym, like flailing around, and someone's like, what is that? I can't be like, well, what do you think it is? Why do you think this is good?
Yeah, I just say like, you want to try it?
Yeah, I do that too. And they're like, oh my gosh, like that would hurt my feet, blah, blah. I have had some people try it. Like I've gotten some people, I'm like, you have to take your shoes and socks off because I don't want you wiping it on your socks on my like smooth beam. I should carry around like a little Foot Collective card, like you can purchase these right here at tfcshop.com. I don't know. Because sometimes I'll tell people that. I'm like, are they really like remembering this?
Yeah, that's right. If it's important enough to them, they'll probably remember it. And it's like I've almost looked at asking questions as like a game. It's like, how can I not give any answers? And sometimes I'll, especially with the beam, people are like, whoa, what is that? So do you want to try it? And if they're like, oh, I can never do that. Why do you say that? It's like you just get them speaking, because then you find out so much about them. But that pathway of extracting information requires you to ask really good coherent questions. So it's kind of like a game.
Yeah, I just need to get better at it in general. But so I'm here to learn from you guys and figure out how to be sneaky like that. But yeah, my take on it.
A lot of it is just getting reps. Is like, like a lot of things we do will attract curiosity. Like the other day, I brought a beam to a park, and a bunch of people that walked by were like kind of like spying over, and like, some of them like, do you want to come try this? Just take your shoes off. And so I think the more outlier things you do, the more opportunities there are for conversations. Like the amount of conversations I have in airports when I'm walking around barefoot is like a lot of opportunities to, and it's funny because when you get the same question asked of you so many times, each one is an opportunity for a different experiment of like, how can I ask a different question to this person? And my favorite one to be when people are like, why aren't you wearing shoes, is why are you wearing shoes? And then you find out immediately why they think they need to wear shoes. And it's just like, yeah, it's kind of fun. Some people get frustrated. They're like, fuck off, give me the answer.
And what are some of the things they say when you ask them why they're wearing shoes? Like,
a lot of them are like a blank, like have a kind of a blank look, and they just stare at you, and they're like, well, to stop my feet from getting dirty. I'm like, why are your feet getting dirty a bad thing? You can clean them. Anyway, it depends on the person also, because you know, like I often get asked that question by women wearing high heels. It's this weird pattern where it's like they're the ones who just feel okay asking me. And so sometimes I ask, why are you wearing, do those feel good on your feet? That's one I ask often. And
they're like, no, but I look good.
Yeah, they're like, no, but they look great. I'm like, yeah, but your feet being deformed don't look great. I don't say that. That's what I think. Anyway, let's go, Lori and Justin. Just kind of give your take on fielding questions about health, and then we'll just kind of have a little discussion. And I have a couple points written down that hopefully will sort of give people some ammo to use when facing questions. And hopefully we can, like I said, all kind of come to an agreement on how we can better answer questions, and just like heuristics to keep in mind. So Lori, you want to go for it?
Sure. I nerded out and wrote down a couple of bullet points as we were talking. I actually had an instance recently where I have a friend that's a physical therapist, and he always hounds me with like, well, why are you doing this? Why are you doing mobility? Why do you do this? And so it was interesting that we're actually talking about this, because like my number one thing that I always go to is like that fight or flight mode, because I'm like, oh, I'm not knowledgeable enough and I don't know enough to answer these questions. And but one of the things that I've realized is that you don't have to be all knowing in the answer. It's more so like, it seems to the person that's asking the question, it always seems to bring it more personable when you're like, well, I don't know all the science behind it, but this is how I've seen it relate to me. Like, I've dived into the whole nasal breathing lately for running. And it's like, no, I don't have a degree in Wim Hof and everything, but this is what I've noticed, how it's benefiting me as a runner. And like, we actually had a decent conversation. And so like making it personable, putting it out there, hey, I don't know 100%, like, just acknowledging and kind of humbling yourself that you don't know everything, but you're learning. And that kind of gives you a respect and like that you're not trying to come off as like this person that's, you're just not trying to come off as a know-it-all. And I feel like that really helps with the person that's trying to understand what you're doing, and it brings it down from attack mode to more of a conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think saying I don't know all the science or I don't have a degree, I think that's more, you're just a humble person, so that's what you feel. But I don't think you actually have to say that. Like I never say, well, I don't know all the science, because to be quite frank, a lot of the science is bullshit. A lot of the science is maybe not bullshit, but so specific that it becomes irrelevant in a general conversation about something. And I think one of the heuristics I wrote down is that if you're sharing your experience, you can never be wrong. You can never be wrong with sharing they might give you something better to try or something different to try, and you may figure out a better way eventually. But by sharing your experience, you never have to be afraid of giving a wrong answer, because you're not giving an answer. You're just sharing what you've learned and where you're coming from. And doing that does two things. One, the other person now knows your perspective. Therefore, if they have a different perspective, they can share it. And if that perspective wasn't even in the realm of reality, they now have a new piece of information to kind of deal with, right? To embark on their own kind of like, idea ping pong with. And so, yeah, I think, and the tone of the question in person, like online, there's obviously no tone, but the tone of the person coming at you with a question often gives you a really good idea of whether that person's worth engaging with or not. If someone, like I get this sometimes where people just are asking you a leading question because they want to prove you wrong.
Exactly.
And if you never state a fact, or if all you do is state your experience, they get frustrated because they can't say you're wrong, because there's no way of being wrong, right? Like you can't ask a question and be wrong. Like, what's the worst that happens? It's not a good question. That's okay. So yeah, share your story, and being the example and trying the things most people aren't willing to try gives you a lot of experience to share, right? That's a really cool thing about just, like Liz said, doing the weird things that other people won't do can give you some really weird insights that it's like, shit, I never would have figured that out. So thanks for sharing that, Laurie. Justin, you want to give it a go?
Yeah, sure, Nick. Absolutely. And that was a great point, is sharing the experience. I find that with a lot of the people I'm working with and that I get to interact and meet with, that's, just kind of exposing like, hey, I am vulnerable too. And I've experienced a lot of this loss, but it's helped me understand and uncovered a lot more that I'm able to share and maybe sort of give you some perspective as well from. So I find like that with a lot of people has helped me bring myself down to their level, especially with a lot of the questions I'm asked. And then from there, kind of building up a little bit. So I certainly always try to come from like, with a lot of like love and respect and a lot of being very humble, so that, I don't come across, as many of us, hope to do, is like having all the answers and not being like a machine. So yeah, certainly for me, it's I'm always trying to seek and ask more questions so we can get more to the root cause of things. And I want to kind of do more detectiving with people. So asking a lot more questions has helped me get further into, where the sources of these issues. And from there, like, what kind of habits can we scale back? What kind of tiny approaches can we begin, or that feel accessible or feel approachable, to begin working outward from there? And that's steering things in that direction more recently has been very helpful. Absolutely. And it's a nice approach to take, feeling that where people want to potentially lead up to or build up to feels approachable and able to kind of start at a level that feels interesting, but also not taking on too much. Absolutely. And that's something I noticed a lot is people trying to get all the answers all at once, or trying to take on too much at once. I'm like, whoa, let's not overcomplicate things. Let's kind of dial back and let's get into understanding, like, where are the sources of these issues, and kind of dial it back into a little bit of time. That's going to see a lot more of a sustainable practice or development in the long term. Absolutely.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for that. And I think
Nick, I'm here. So
oh yeah. So
yeah,
I
just
I totally forgot. Thank you. Go for it.
Did you want to say something before, or?
No, that's good.
Okay.
After you're done, I got a good analogy, but when you're done, I'll mention it.
I'm sorry, I don't have the video because I can't make it work on my phone. So yeah.
It's all good. We can hear you well.
Anyway, little gray person there. Well, I find I work as a massage therapist, among other things. So I ask my clients a lot of questions, but I'm still learning to ask more questions, to like follow-up questions. I ask them a lot of different questions, but I find that some people I can talk to them for quite a while, and they are interested in the questions, and they also answers and makes them think. They say, oh, I've never thought about that before, or it makes them think a lot, and it makes them partake more in what's going on. Some people don't have the time. They've come there, they come and they throw themselves on the massage table, and I'm like, hey, stop asking me questions. I don't want to talk to you. Just fix me, or something like that. So so some people are easier and some are more difficult, depending on what they think they want to get and where they want to go. Some people just want to be fixed, and some people actually want to be able to fix themselves. So I do find I have been asking myself a lot of questions. I just thought about that. I'm also on a journey. I've been for a long time, and I keep asking myself, why this and why that? Why am I feeling this? What happened here? And I guess I'll be thinking about which questions I actually ask myself, and maybe ask my clients the same thing. So, but it's easier for them to be part of it all if they actually have to think a bit, not just be fed answers all the time, because those are the ones that actually engage, and things happen when they have to think.
Yes,
as well.
and I think you brought up a really good point where the questions we ask ourselves create a template for questions that we can ask others. And that's really where a lot of this comes from, right? Like the only way you know to ask a question is often if you've already asked it of yourself. So asking questions regularly to yourself of why you do certain things, how you can unravel a habit you're trying to break, how you can create a habit you're trying to form, like that journey is literally the foundation for everything you could do to help others. And I think the problem, a big part of the problem with higher health education is that you're given all the answers. Therefore, you just take those answers and think that that is the truth. But you've never actually had to discover the answers. You've never had to ask questions to determine whether those answers that you were given are actually valid. And so, you know, I always look at when someone comes to see me for help, I look at them as like a Rubik's Cube that's all messed up and jumbled up. And really what people want is to just take the stickers off and put them in the right orientation and be like, yeah, sweet, give me the answer. And it's like if you don't cheat and take the stickers off, every question you ask is a move, is a Rubik's Cube move. And sometimes you go down the wrong path and you mess things up even more, you confuse them even more. And my goal is always give a person some sort of clarity at the end of our interaction, not to make them feel like they're doing shittier than they thought or be more confused than they thought. It's like have some clarity. And like you said, Justin, a lot of people just try and do everything all at once. And all they need is for someone to say, you don't have to do all that right now. Like you just have to do this. And what is your core question of why you're not taking action with this? And so that the series of questions you ask is like these moves for the Rubik's Cube to get it more clear so that they can then, like, it's almost like they got stuck on the Rubik's Cube. All you have to do is a couple moves, ask a couple good questions, and then they're like, all right, I'll take this cube and I'll come back when I reach a wall again. The goal is not for them to know what to do when they're done. It's to have a direction for further learning and hopefully more clarity. So I think one thing that's really important is the fact that it's okay to say you don't know. And this is like, it's liberating, number one, because you don't have to pretend to know anything anymore. And by just sharing your story, you also don't have to pretend to know anything because you're just giving your perspective. That's all you can give. And our goal is to have a deeper perspective on health by just experimenting and exploring deeper than anyone else. And I think that's really sort of the spirit of a foot nerd. It's just like, do the shit not everyone else will be doing, whether they even know to do it or whether they're willing to do it, so that you can come back and be like, hey, I did this, it wasn't that bad. And this is the cool stuff that I found. And then they're like, oh, interesting. And they might not do it, but maybe they will. Maybe you'll have blazed the trail so that they're like, all right, well, I'm not as intimidated now. So being okay saying I don't know, and then having the curiosity to try and find out, right? Like running an experiment on yourself or having a chat on Slack with the rest of the nerds. I think that's a really important thing for Q&A. And then, you know, trying to leave people with some learning to do. So that can be either asking them a question that makes them kind of think deeper on something, or guiding them towards a resource so that they have learning to do, right? Not giving a prescription. Like health professional school, like physio, is all about prescribing things. And it's so goofy because non-compliance is blamed on the patients when it's like, if they want to do it and it's the right thing to do, they shouldn't have to comply. They should actually want to do it. And it's like, I think that's the biggest cop out of all health professionals, is blaming non-compliance on patients instead of ineffectiveness on themselves. I've done it many times. And I think that, you know, with the Q&A and Mighty, it's really about, you know, people who joined late, I was saying that questions we receive from the community are extremely powerful learning moments for us, because maybe they ask a question we haven't asked ourselves or explored ourselves. But at minimum, we get an idea of common perspectives held by people, blind spots, you know, false assumptions that they've made, right? Like the assumption that you need support in footwear is a really common false assumption. And telling people they don't need support is not a good answer to that question. Asking, why do you feel you need support, right? Oh, I was told by so-and-so. And then, you know, from there, like I look at these sort of I look at it all through play. So this is like a game. It's like, I've realized that you don't need support. Your feet don't need support. This person is vehemently convinced that they need support in order to walk like a human being. I want to find out who they found that out from, so that at least I understand, like, are they appealing to authority because someone with a fancy name told them that? Or did they have an experience like Liz, the lady that hurt her plantar fascia when they went without support? And you maybe have to qualify that experience and say like, well, the way you thought about it, maybe there's more to it. And so it's literally by just putting yourself out there and creating opportunities to answer questions, engaging with the Q&A on Mighty or with your family and friends. Like, find the people who you disagree with most and are the hardest to have conversations with, and use that as like your cold exposure for good Q&A reps. Because literally, if you turn it into a game, it's all fun. The most frustrating, for me, previously the most frustrating conversations turned into the funnest games, because it's like, I have nothing to lose. I'm just curious. I want to know why you feel that way. And so I think that's a big game changer, has been a big game changer for me, because I no longer need to feel like the knower. I no longer have pressure to know. I can say I don't know, and all I have to do is share my story. And if people ask a question that I don't know, it's like, perfect. I haven't explored that yet. It's like, thank you. It's like, when a good Q&A interaction is a dual learning experience. It's not one person learning and one person teaching. It's two people learning. So that was a lot of babble, but I think the last one the last little note I had written down, and then we'll just go free flow if anyone has questions, is the power of frameworks and heuristics. Because it's like giving an answer without giving an answer, right? And just giving someone, like, if you can develop a 3-minute pitch for the 5 pillars of health and why we use the 5 pillars of health, because really what I look at a framework as is like a blueprint for the structure of something with no finished details. So we can all have a blueprint for the same house and end up with radically different houses, right? The skeleton is the same. It gives us some common ground to compare notes on, gives us some structure to work with. But what doors we choose to put on, what doorknobs, what mirrors, what colors, all that kind of stuff is totally different. And it should be, because we're all different humans. So the 5 pillars of health, I think, is a really great framework, because when I talk to someone about the 5 pillars of health, I then pivot to, what pillar do you think needs the most love right now? Because that's all we're going to focus on. And then, so we've eliminated 80% of what was going through their brain. Now they only got 20% to deal with. And then within that, we say like, okay, well, what's one thing you think you can do to improve that pillar? And if they don't have anything to say, then maybe they just have no idea what options they have in terms of behaviors. That's when you can suggest things based on your experience, but you're not saying you should do this, you should do that. It's like, these are things that I've tried. Do any of these seem like they fit with your life? And so you're you're kind of like guiding the person through a maze without telling them the path of how to get through the maze. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So frameworks, very powerful. Heuristics, general things like eat real food, focus on eating real food. And then they're gonna say, well, I don't know what that means. Like, all right, well, I can tell you what I've learned about real food and how to distinguish it from food products. And arming them with tools to engage with their own learning pathway is like super fun, because then they come back if they actually do it. And guess what? If they don't do the stuff, that's fine. You gave them what you needed to, what you could, to kind of have better direction. But at the end of the day, your job is not to do it for them. And maybe that wasn't the right time for them to actually engage with it. But everyone that asks you a question has a reason for asking that question. This is another thing I've learned. Most of the time, the reason they say they're asking the question is not the actual reason. So I used to do this with my physio patients all the time. Why are you coming to see me today? Oh, my shoulder hurts. Okay, well, why did your shoulder, is the shoulder pain the only reason you're coming in here? And you just kind of like ask them, and sometimes I ask the same question in multiple ways, and then they answer differently. And it's like, what? You just changed your answer from a second ago. Okay, this tells me something. And half the time they're like, well, I'm really frustrated because I can't sleep. It's like, all right, let's talk about sleep now, because you think they associated their shoulder pain with why they can't sleep, but maybe they're doing a bunch of other shit that's stopping them from sleeping, right?
Mhm.
So it's like, sometimes just like really go down that question tree if someone's willing to play, and you can sometimes go to the deeper layer that they didn't even know was there, but we're forced to kind of recognize by you asking good questions. So cool.
I have a question for you,
Yeah.
Nick.
Yeah.
So sometimes, you know how like you're saying, you can say like, well, this is from my experience, which
Mhm.
I use, but let's say that you can kind of tell that a person is going down a path that you don't have experience with, but
Mm.
like, you know, a lot of nerds who have. So how do you feel about like saying, well, from my experience, this is where my experience stops, but I know a whole bunch of nerds who like love getting in freezing ice cold lakes. Now I'm not there yet, but that might be something you're ready to check out, you know? And
Mm.
then like, how do you feel about sharing experience in that realm? Like that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in that case, I would say, well, if you haven't dove into cold, maybe trying to have conversations with nerds who have to know step one, right? Like turn
Mhm.
the shower to cold for 30 seconds. Some other nerds have said that that's a great first step. Why don't you try that? And if you want more info and you want to really get into it, maybe I can connect you with a nerd.
Mhm.
But I think knowing if you haven't engaged with a certain like topic or a certain thing, and it's a bigger thing that most people will know about to some extent, then maybe engage trying it yourself,
Mhm.
or speaking with someone who's really deep into it and being like, how do I first start doing this? Like really being, and who knows, if someone says, well, what do you think about cold exposure? If you didn't know anything about it, I would be like, well, I don't know anything about that, but I'm going to learn about it because that sounds fun.
So you're really advocating for not sharing anything that you haven't tried yourself.
Yeah. Because yeah.
I guess I'm gonna have to go to Sweden and dive in a cold lake.
Hey, you sent me a video of you diving into a cold pool one time. Like you've done some of that. You don't have to do like a 1 hour long Wim Hof breathing sessions to know
Okay.
that cold
I was
thing.
yeah, no, I like the clarification though that you're talking about, because I think that's important, right? Like really you're kind of honing in on really doing experiments right down to like a 30-second cold shower. Like if you're going to be engaging
Mhm.
with other people, like do the very one tiny little thing that would give you an experience of the question that you might be answering.
Yeah, and even better, if you haven't experienced that, do it with them. Be like, well, I've never taken a cold shower before, but I'll do it. You do it, and
I don't
when we chat in
know.
a week,
I
we'll
don't know
compare.
about that. Taking a cold
Not-
shower
not
with
together. I mean, you can if you want, but independently do it, and sort of like, because I think there's, the cold one is a good example, because unless you know what it feels like to put yourself under cold water and how easy it is to freak out and stop breathing, it's really hard to give any constructive guidance to someone, because they're just gonna be like, well, that sucked a lot. Why did Ruth tell me to do that? But if you're like, yeah, the first time I did it, I freaked out, I stopped breathing, but then when I got control of my breath, it felt okay. That little nugget can be enough so that someone, when they do freak out, they're like, okay, this is normal. Ruth said this was probably going to happen, so it's okay. So, and here's another thing. To share your experience, you have to be deeply mindful of your experience, because the more details you share about something, the more nuances you share, the more often, the more meaningful it becomes to that, the more memorable it becomes to that person. So if you just kind of like hop in a cold shower, you're like, yeah, I did it once, it was shitty, I didn't do it anymore. It's like, that's not gonna be that useful. But if you really pay attention when you're doing it to how you feel, to your breath, to what it did after, and you explain that stuff, you're creating like this bigger cloud of information that maybe digs down deeper for that person and maybe carries more meaning. So the more mindful you are during your experiences and during your own experiments, I think the better you can articulate that to other people and the more meaning it carries. Hey, Pietra, finally see you.
I connected
Yeah,
to the computer instead.
Yeah, that was a good question though, Ruth, because like, I mean, we all won't have experience in all things. But the more curious we are to experiment, the bigger repertoire we have to kind of share from.
Sure. I was just going to say one other thing that I thought of when we were initially talking about this, is that like as foot nerds, our mission is to lead by example and then inspire other people to reclaim responsibility for their own well-being. And it seems like there's no other way to do that without asking. I mean, like you have to have your main goal to be asking questions, because the minute that we give the answer, we've taken responsibility for that person's experience, right? So I was just thinking how this is actually our most important foundation in a training program is to learn the art of asking good questions. It seems like that almost differentiates what we're doing as foot nerds. If our, manifesto is to do what we say we're going to do, which is like inspire other people to take their own responsibility, then this is the foundation of what we're doing. So I think that's cool.
And it's hard. I mean, when you go to higher education and so-called health, let's call it higher education and symptom management, because that's really what it is. You're programmed into giving answers. You're programmed into thinking of yourself as the person who gives the answers. And so, from my experience, those people who have done those programs, one of the hardest parts is unlearning being the answer giver, because you paid a lot of money to be that person. You identify as that person, you've acted as that person. And so it's hard to, and that's why, like, when I used to treat, I remember some of the other physios would treat doctors, and they're just like, I can't work with this person. Like, they're literally coming in and they don't even want to do what I'm asking them to do. And I would just get them to come see me for a last visit before they were like, fired from the clinic, because they just weren't doing anything to take responsibility for their health. And those people think that they know all the things, and they're just like checking the box of I went to see a physio off. And so, but when you ask that person really good questions, they open up quite a bit. And like, it's just funny how, like, even Laura, you were mentioning that when a physio was asking you questions, it's almost like fight or flight. It's like, oh, I'm under the gun now, I better give good answers. This person knows more than me. By the way, if you know any doctors or physios, you definitely know more about health than them. If we're talking about the average health professional, they know really well how to quote research. And this is as a whole, from my experience, not everyone, but just know that you know more about health by engaging with that process personally than most health professionals know. So just knowing that puts you on a ground where I have a lot to contribute, instead of just feeling like you have to defend yourself. So yeah. And I mean, one thing that I found myself doing is when people quote research, I ask, what tells you that research is valid in this topic? Like, how much can you really take from that? Like, how was the study? I always ask people, how was the study done? And if they can't answer that, then they have no right quoting any results from a study they don't even know how it was done. And you'd be shocked at how many people actually don't actually read the study. They read the headline usually. If they go one step further, they read the results and the conclusion. And if they go one step further, which almost no one seems to go, they actually read the methodology and the entire research premise. And if you do that, and you look at how little applicability that little snippet of the puzzle has to this conversation we're having, then it really helps to put things into context for people, where this research paper means actually very little in the conversation we're having right now, yet you're using it as the be all and end all to prove a point that you're claiming to know. And just always be curious and not defensive, I think is such a big thing, because it's like human instinct to be defensive, of be like, if you disidentify from any ideas, you have very little to be defensive about. But it's really hard to, like, you got to catch yourself. And that's part of the exercise of getting good with reps with questions and answers, is coming into it with a curiosity of trying to understand the other person, and not trying to, I mean, all nerds seem to be pretty super chill people, but you're going to encounter a lot of people who want to prove you wrong. And it's important not to engage with that battle, and just go in with curiosity and ask them good questions. Yeah. The more money someone spent on the degree, the harder, the funner the game is, like, literally. So yeah, I think with Mighty, if you want to go in and answer questions, or even with TFC app, although we're probably just going to shift the Q&A element over to Mighty, because it seems to be a more welcoming platform. It's when you're asked a question, one thing you can let people know is what not to do. Like, you can't really tell people what to do, but you can say with a pretty good degree of certainty things that we shouldn't be doing. Like, you shouldn't be wearing pointy, rigid, stiff shoes. Like, we can probably say with a high degree of certainty that is the truth. You can't tell people what shoes they should wear, but you can tell them what shoes not to wear. So you can say things that we should aim to not do. But if you're answering a question, try and lead with another question, which is harder in the digital format because you're not, it's, you know, we don't want to have conversations on social media all day long. And so with online, maybe the best thing to do is give a little snippet from your experience and then give them a resource for further inquiry. And that could be a YouTube video, that could be you know, a book or an article. And the more resources you have in your kind of, you know, pool of resources, the more you have to pluck from. And so you can never go wrong sharing your story. It's okay to say, I don't know. And the best way to answer a question online is to share from your experience and then give them a resource for further inquiry. And if we have, you know, if we have a big gap with a resource that we're like, you know, this person asked about this, but I have nothing to send them to, then we'll create it, right? But we have tons of stuff in Beam Tribe where it's like everything from knee pain, back pain, plantar fasciitis, how to transition to natural footwear. You know, like one of the things I did when I piloted the one-on-one virtual consults was I had a cheat sheet. I had a cheat sheet of like knee pain, and then I had a link. Back pain, and then I had a link, how to run an experiment, and then I had a link, and I had like 40 links. And then at the end of a session, I would pick like 3 or 4 of them that were most relevant from our conversation and say, here's where you go to learn more. And that was, you know, it ended with them having a further learning process or a question to answer for themselves, not with an answer to then go and implement. So I think that should always be our aim. And yeah, thank you all for your time today, because you know, these are, I find myself talking more than I probably should and would like to. So I'm sorry about that, but hopefully that was helpful. And does anyone have any questions about that? Just get reps in. That's the big thing. Is like just answer a lot of questions with questions, turn it into a game. It's kind of like the don't turn left game where like you always have to like, okay, to go that way, I got to turn right to go that way, where like you kind of, you know, like if you're really trying to ask questions and not give answers, it's really, really hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I always just, you know, the fallback is just share your experience. You can never go wrong, ever. And, you know, if anything, you might learn something. If the other person shares their experience, you're like, I never thought of that. I'm going to try that. See if mine's still valid. And if you disidentify and disconnect from any, from like latching onto any concept and are radically open-minded, being like, if someone said gravity didn't exist tomorrow, and I could experience that, I'll believe it. If you're like, just like, I'm just going to take what comes, it's always a fun game to play.
Mm-hmm. That's the practice there, right? It's the practice. It almost seems like what you're saying too, is that the practice is not necessarily going to study so that you have all the answers. The practice is learning how to, number one, ask the good questions, and then practice the art of, whatever it is that you just said.
Not giving answers.
Yeah, to practice the art of doing your own experiments and holding that space so that you can have an interesting interaction where it's a fun game. Otherwise, it's not fun at all.
And the pause, like, okay, this is like a big airport insight. When I ask, why are you wearing shoes? I wait uncomfortably long periods of time for them to speak. Because the tendency is to just like cover that space by saying something else. And sometimes it's real weird, but it's okay. But you can tell, like in their brain, they're like, oh shit, what do I say to this? I don't know why I wear shoes. Why do I wear shoes? Why? And it's like, but it's good though. And so sometimes you just have to give, you know, like maybe people don't have an answer to the question you ask them, and that's okay.
But they'll think about it on their plane ride.
They will think
later,
about it. You will be in their memory.
Yeah.
Yep. So.
I love that Rubik's Cube analogy too. That is so true. Yeah. I'm guilty of wanting to take the stickers off for sure.
Yeah,
I'm like,
me too.
Pooling.
Yeah. And I think the tendency, you know, the thing I want to get across is that we don't have to solve the Rubik's Cube in the interaction. Mm-hmm. The best way to leave an interaction is to help them do a partial solution to the Rubik's Cube, to then take that on their own and then work to solve it and mess up a lot of times. Like, mm-hmm. You know, it's almost, you don't want to stop people from making mistakes. This is another thing too. All we're trying to do is usher them to a more streamlined way of discovering their truth. And I think one of the things is like, because this whole thing about defining health, which I'm like super obsessed with these days, of asking people like, how do you define health? is because even if you're helping this person towards what you think is the solution to the Rubik's Cube, which is like all sides the same color, maybe their definition of health is not all sides the same color. So maybe that's not where you're trying to work towards. And so understanding, like, what are you trying to get to? Like, why are you coming to see me? That's where I love that question. So broad in general. It puts it back on them to be like, why are you actually here? What do you want to get from this? And they're like, well, I just want to be healthy. What does healthy mean to you? And they don't have an answer. It's like, you can't get somewhere you don't even know where it is, right? Like, you can't hit the bullseye on a target you don't have. And so sometimes we can help them recalibrate their target to something that's maybe more in line with like our perspective of health, because we have probably a deeper perspective of health than most people. But making sure that we're not putting our perspective onto someone else and saying that's what you need to do.
So I'm wondering if maybe a good follow-up for something like this is that since we've been participating, that if we do this again, that we actually practice like asking each other questions. Because I realize that as you're saying, like the two questions that you ask me a lot, that I'm like, oh shit, why do you think that, Ruth? And why do you say that? I'm like, I always get a little caught off guard. But I realize that we could use the practice on like digging for questions. And so maybe that's where we go next with our discussion, since there's, looks like we have this is a good conversation to have.
Yeah. So maybe we do this in like a month or even a couple months from now. And then we all bring like the funnest interaction or the most memorable situation that we had in terms of when it was really hard to ask a question instead of giving an answer, or when we caught ourselves giving an answer. That's a really good one, because that's a really, I catch myself daily giving answers. It's just being mindful of it, right? Like once it's on your radar to not give answers and to ask more questions, it's like a little seed planted in the base of your skull that will always be there, whether you realize it or not. So just, let's do this in, I don't know, maybe a month or a couple months. We'll see what the thing is. And we can even, we could even create a Q&A channel in Slack. And then, because sometimes when you like get a memorable experience, it's good to just jump on and be like, hey, this happened today. It was great. Yeah. This is what I learned, instead of like trying to bottle it up 6 weeks later. So
yeah, that's a good idea. One time after we had a situation like this, how family dynamics can be pretty intense sometimes. And I asked my mom, she said something, and my instinct was to get all fired up and defend myself. And I said, well, why do you say that? It was like the best thing I could have asked. I had no idea that it was going to go that well.
Yeah. And those are memorable. Those make that's like contributes to thinking of that in future, because you're like, ooh, that one really felt good, or that one's like the ones that sting and the ones that feel amazing are really memorable. So yeah.
And I think the one last thing I was going to say is that it required something of me, that when I asked her, why do you say that? That meant that I was going to then have to listen too, instead of just spew what I wanted to say, which is spew what I wanted to do. When she started to answer the question, I was like, oh shit, now I'm responsible to actually listen to her. And that was very interesting too. I was like, oh, pay attention, because I don't know where this is going.
Yeah, you can't just be like, yeah, good job. Oh shit.
It was good.
I want to point out that if you don't want to take the stickers off a Rubik's Cube, you can actually disassemble it and put it back. I know people that got super into Rubik's Cubes, like doing it super fast. When you take it apart and you like grease the bearings so that you can slide it really easily, like do it with one hand. So,
oh my god,
that's metaphorical. Like break it down into the pieces, and like you'd have to actually like take the person apart, I suppose. But
yeah, might be hard to put Humpty Dumpty back together again in real life. But cool. Any other questions before I wrap up? All right, let's just ask some great questions, and I'll go into Slack right now, and I'll create. I think that's word questions on my mind. I'll create the question Q&A channel, and then we can sort of share in there. And if there's a need to, then we'll have another one of these discussions. And cool. Yeah, we can. I think all of these are just learning, ways to learn and share of how if we could be the best tribe of question askers, then like we're doing something right.
Yeah.
Because one thing I realized is like asking questions is an indirect admission of not knowing. And that's very powerful. Because a lot of people that are extremely confident that they know and are really just only know what they know. And by not knowing, they think they know all there is to know because they don't know how much there is to know. So cool. Thanks
All
for the
right.
time, everyone. Thanks, Ruth, for
Yes.
organizing this.
Thank you.
Thank
And,
you.
We'll
Looking
talk when we
forward
talk.
to talking on Slack. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
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 Bye.